A Prisoner in the Caucasus by Leo Tolstoy. A Russian gentleman was serving as an officer in the army of the Caucasus. His name was Zealand. One day, a letter from his home came to him. His old mother wrote him,
I am now getting along in years, and I should like to see my beloved son before I die. Come and bid me farewell. Lay me in the ground, and then, with my blessing, return again to your service. And I have been finding a bride for you, and she is intelligent and handsome, and has property. If she pleases you, why, then you can marry and settle down together.
Zealand thought the matter over. It is very true. She has been growing feeble. Maybe I shall not have a chance to see her again. I'll go, and if the girl is pretty, then I might marry. He went to his colonel, got his leave of absence, bade his comrades farewell, gave the soldiers of his command 9 gallons of vodka as a parting treat, and made his arrangements to leave. There was war at that time in the Caucasus. The roads were not open for travel, either by day or night. If any Russian rode or walked outside of the fortress, the Tartars were likely either to kill him or carry him off to the mountains. And it was arranged that twice a week an escort of soldiers should go from fortress to fortress. In front and behind marched the soldiers, and the travellers rode in the middle. It was now summertime. At sunrise the baggage train was made up behind the fortification. The guard of soldiery marched ahead, and the procession moved along the road. Zealand was on horseback, and his effects were on a cart which formed part of the train. They had 16.5 miles to travel. The train proceeded slowly. Sometimes the soldiers halted. Sometimes a wagon wheel came off, or a horse balked, and all had to stop and wait. The sun was already past the zenith, but the train had only gone halfway. It was dusty and hot. The sun was fierce, and there was no shelter. A bald step, not a tree or a shrub, along the road. Zealand rode on ahead, occasionally stopping and waiting till the train caught up with him. He would listen and hear the signal on the horn to halt again. And Zealand thought, had I now better go on alone without the soldiers? I have a good horse under me. If I fall in with the Tartars, I can escape. Or shall I wait? He kept stopping and pondering, and just then another officer, also on horseback, rode up to him. His name was Tolstoy, and he had a musket. He said, Zealand, let us ride on ahead together. I'm so hungry that I cannot stand it any longer, and the heat, too. You could wring my shirt out. Tolstoy was a heavy, stout, ruddy man, and the sweat was dripping from him. Zealand reflected and said, And your musket is loaded? It is. All right, let us go, only on one condition, not to separate. And they started on up the road. They rode along the steppe, talking and looking at each side. There was a wide sweep of view in all directions. As soon as the steppe came to an end, the road went into a pass between 2 mountains, and Zealand said, I must ride up on that mountain and reconnoitre. Otherwise, you see, they might come down from the mountain and surprise us. But Tolstoy said, What is there to reconnoitre? Let us go ahead. Zealand did not heed him. No, says he, you wait for me here below. I'll just glance around. Then he spurred his horse up the mountain to the left. The horse that Zealand rode was a hunter. He had bought her out of a drove of colts, paying 100 rubles for her, and he had himself trained her. She bore him up the steep slope as if on wings. He had hardly reached the summit when before him, on a place a little less than 3 acres, mounted Tartars were standing. There were 30 of them. He saw them and started to turn back, but the Tartars had caught sight of him. They set out in pursuit of him, unstrapping their weapons as they galloped. Zealand dashed down the precipice with all the speed of his horse, and cried to Kostuilin, "Fire your gun!" And to his horse he said, though not aloud, "Little mother, carry me safely, don't stumble. If you trip up, I am lost. If we get back to the gun, we won't fall into their hands." But Kostuilin, as soon as he saw the Tartars, instead of waiting for him, galloped on with all his might toward the fortress. With his whip he belaboured his horse, first on one side, then on the other. All that could be seen through the dust was the horse twitching her tail. Zealand saw that his case was desperate. The gun was gone. Nothing was to be done with a saber alone. He turned his horse back toward the train. He thought he might escape that way. But in front of him he saw that 6 were galloping down the slope. His horse was good, but theirs were better, and besides, they had got the start of him. He attempted to wheel about and was going to dash ahead again, but his horse had got momentum and could not be held back. He flew straight down toward them. He saw a red-bearded Tartar approaching him on a grey horse. He was gaining on him. He was gnashing his teeth. He was getting his gun ready. "Well," thought Zealand, "I know you devils. If you should take me prisoner, you would put me into a hole and flog me with a whip. I won't give myself up alive." Now, Zealand was not of great size, but he was an Ulan. He drew his saber, spurred his horse straight at the red-bearded Tartar. He said to himself, "Either I will crush him with my horse, or I will hack him down with my saber." Zealand, however, did not reach the place on horseback. Suddenly, from behind him, gunshots were fired at the horse. The horse fell headlong and pinned Zealand's leg to the ground. He tried to arise, but already 2 ill-smelling Tartars were sitting on him and pinioning his hands behind his back. He burst from them, knocking the Tartars over, but 3 others had leaped from their horses and began to beat him on the head with their gun stocks. His sight failed him, and he staggered. The Tartars seized him, took from their saddles extra saddle girths, bent his arms behind his back, fastened them with a Tartar knot, and lifted him up. They took his saber from him, pulled off his boots, made a thorough search of him, relieved him of his money and his watch, and tore his clothes in pieces. Zealand glanced at his horse. The poor beast lay as she had fallen, on her side, and was kicking vainly, trying to rise. In her head was a hole, and from the hole the black blood was pouring. The dust, for a yard around, was wet with it. A Tartar went to the horse to remove the saddle. She was still kicking, so the man took out his dagger and cut her throat. The throat gave a whistling sound, a trembling ran over the body, and all was over. The Tartars took off the saddle and the other trappings. The one with the red beard mounted his horse, and the others lifted Zealand behind him, and in order to keep him from falling, they fastened him with the reins to the Tartar's belt, and thus they carried him off to the mountains. Zealand sat behind, swaying and bumping his face against the stinking Tartar's back. All that he could see before him was the healthy Tartar back, and the sinewy neck, and the smooth-shaven nape, showing blue beneath the cap. Zealand's head ached. The blood trickled into his eyes, and it was impossible for him to get a more comfortable position on the horse, or wipe away the blood. His arms were so tightly bound that his collarbones ached. They rode along from mountain to mountain. They forded a river. Then they entered a highway and rode along a valley. Zealand tried to follow the route that they took him, but his eyes were glued together with blood, and it was impossible for him to turn round. began to grow dark. They crossed still another river and began to climb a rocky mountain. There was an odor of smoke. The barking of dogs was heard. They had reached a small Tartar village, an owl. The Tartars dismounted. The Tartar children came running up and surrounded Zealand, whistling and exulting. Finally, they began to hurl stones at him. The Tartar drove away the children, lifted Zealand from the horse, and called a menial. A Nogayet with prominent cheekbones came at the call. He wore only a shirt. The shirt was torn. His whole breast was bare. The Tartar gave him some order. The menial brought a footstock. It consisted of 2 oaken blocks provided with iron rings, and in one of the rings was a clamp with a lock. They unfastened Zealand's arms, put on the clog, and took him to a shed, pushed him in, and shut the door. Zealand fell on the manure. As he lay there, he felt round in the darkness, and when he had found a place that was less foul, he stretched himself out. Zealand scarcely slept that night. The nights were short. He saw through a crack that it was growing light. Zealand got up, widened the crack, and managed to look out. Through the crack he could see a road leading down from the mountain. At the right, a Tartar hut with 2 trees near it. A black dog was lying on the road. A she-goat with her kids was walking by. They were shaking their tails. He saw coming down the mountain a young Tartar girl in a variegated shirt, ungirdled, in pantalettes and boots. Her head was covered with a kaftan, and on it she bore a great tin water jug. She walked along, swaying and bending her back, and holding by the hand a little shaven-headed Tartar urchin who wore a single shirt. After the Tartar maiden had gone into the sakler with her water jug, the red-bearded Tartar of the evening before came out, wearing a silk beshmet, a silver dagger in his belt, and bashmaks or sandals on his bare feet. On the back of his head was a high cap of sheepskin, dyed black. He came out, stretched himself, stroked his red beard. He paused, gave some order to the menial, and went off somewhere. Then 2 children on horseback came along on their way to the watering trough. The snouts of the horses were wet. Other shaven-headed youngsters, with nothing but shirts on, and nothing on their legs, formed a little band and came to the shed. They got a dry stick and stuck it through the crack. Zealand growled "Ugh" at them. The children began to squeal and scatter in every direction as fast as their legs would carry them. Only their bare knees glistened. But Zealand began to be thirsty. His throat was parched. He said to himself, "I wonder if they won't come to look after me." While he was listening, the barn doors were thrown open. The red Tartar came in, and with him another, of slighter stature and of dark complexion. His eyes were bright and black, his cheeks ruddy, his little beard well-trimmed, his face jolly, and always enlivened with a grin. The dark man's clothing was still richer, a beshmet of blue silk, embroidered with gold lace. In his belt a great silver dagger, red Morocco bashmaks embroidered with silver, and over the fine bashmaks he wore a long pair of stout ones. His cap was tall, of white lamb's wool. The red Tartar came in, muttered something, gave vent to some abusive language, and then stood leaning against the wall, fingering his dagger and scowling under his brows at Zealand, like a wolf. But the dark Tartar, nervous and active, and always on the go, as if he were made of springs, came straight up to Zealand, squatted down on his heels, showed his teeth, tapped him on the shoulder, began to gabble something in his own language, winked his eyes, and clucking his tongue, kept saying, "A fine Rus! A fine Rus!" Zealand did not understand him, and said, "Drink. Give me some water." The Dark One grinned, and all the time he kept babbling, "A fine Rus!" Zealand signified by his hands and lips that they should give him water. The Dark One understood, grinned, put his head out of the door, and cried, "Tina!" A young girl came running in, a slender, lean creature of 13, with a face like the Dark Man's. Evidently she was his daughter. She also had black, luminous eyes, and she was very pretty. She was dressed in a long blue shirt with wide sleeves and without a belt. On the bottom, on the breast, and on the cuffs it was relieved with red trimmings. She wore on her legs pantalettes and bashmaks, and over the bashmaks another pair with high heels. On her neck was a necklace wholly composed of Russian half-ruble pieces. Her head was uncovered. She had her hair in a black braid, and on the braid was a ribbon, and to the ribbon was attached various ornaments and a silver rouble. Her father gave her some command. She ran out and quickly returned, bringing a little tin pitcher. After she had handed him the water, she also squatted on her heels in such a way that her knees were higher than her shoulders. She sat that way and opened her eyes and stared at Zealand while he was drinking, as if he were some wild beast. Zealand offered to return the pitcher to her. She darted away like a wild goat. Even her father laughed. He sent her after something else. She took the pitcher, ran out, and brought back some unleavened bread on a small round board, and again squatted down and stared without taking her eyes from him. The Tartars went out, and again bolted the door. After a while the Nogayets also came to Zealand and said, "Aida, Kotzain Aida." But he did not know Russian either. Zealand, however, perceived that he wished him to go somewhere. Zealand hobbled out with his clog. It was impossible to walk, so he had to drag one leg. The Nogayets led the way for him. He saw a Tartar village, a dozen houses, and the native mosque with its minaret. In front of one house stood 3 horses, saddled. Lads held them by their bridles. From this house came the dark Tartar, and beckoned with his hand, signifying that Zealand was to come to him. He grinned and kept saying something in his own tongue, and went into the house. Zealand followed him. The room was decent. The walls were smoothly plastered with clay. Against the front wall were placed feather beds. On the sides hung costly rugs. On the rugs were guns, pistols, and sabres, all silver-mounted. On one side a little oven was set in, on a level with the floor. The floor was of earth, clean as a threshing floor, and the whole of the front part was covered with felt. Rugs were distributed over the felt, and on the rugs were down pillows. On the rugs were sitting some Tartars with bashmaks only on their feet. The dark Tartar, the red-bearded one, and 3 guests. Behind their backs down cushions were placed, and before them on wooden plates were pancakes of millet flour and melted butter in a cup, and the Tartar beer, called buza, in a pitcher. They ate with their fingers, and all dipped into the butter. The dark man leaped up,
bade Zealand sit on one side, not on a rug, but on the bare floor. Going back again to his rug, he served his guests with cakes and boozer. The menial showed Zealand his place. He himself took off his outside bashmaks, placed them by the door in a row with the bashmaks of the other guests, and took his seat on the felt as near as possible to his master's. And while they ate, he looked at them, and his mouth watered. After the Tartars had finished eating the pancakes, a Tartar woman entered, dressed in the same sort of shirt as the girl wore, and in pantalettes. Her head was covered with a handkerchief. She carried out the butter and the cakes, and brought a handsome finger bowl, and a pitcher with a narrow nose. The Tartars proceeded to wash their hands. Then they folded their arms, knelt down, and puffed on all sides, and said their prayers. Then they talked together in their own tongue. Finally, one of the guests, a Tartar, approached Zealand and began to speak to him in Russian. "Qazi Muhammad made you prisoner," said he, pointing to the red-bearded Tartar. "And he has given you to Abdul Murat," indicating the dark one. "Abdul Murat is now your master." Zealand said nothing. Abdul Murat began to talk, all the time pointing toward Zealand, and grinned as he talked. "Zuldak Urus, Karasha Urus," the dragoman went on to say. "He commands you to write a letter home, and have them send money to ransom you. As soon as money is sent, he will set you free." Zealand pondered a little, and then said, "Does he wish a large ransom?" The Tartars took counsel together, and then the dragoman said, 3,000 silver roubles. "No," replied Zealand, "I can't pay that." Abdul leaped up, began to gesticulate and talk to Zealand. He seemed all the time to think that Zealand understood him. The dragoman translated his words. "He means," says he, "how much will you give?" Zealand, after pondering a little, said, 500 roubles. Then the Tartars all began to talk at once. Abdul began to scream at the red-bearded Tartar. He grew so excited as he talked that the spittle flew from his mouth. But the red-bearded Tartar only frowned and clucked with his tongue. When all became silent again, the dragoman said, 500 roubles is not enough to buy you of your master. He himself has paid 200 for you. Qazi Muhammad was in debt to him. He took you for the debt. 3,000 roubles. It is no use to send less. But if you don't write, they will put you in a hole and flog you with a whip." Said Zealand to himself, "The more cowardly one is, the worse it is for him." He leaped to his feet and said, "Now you tell him, dog that he is, that if he thinks he's going to frighten me, then I will not give him a single kopeck, nor will I write. I am not afraid of you, and you will never make me afraid of you, you dog." The dragoman interpreted this to them, and again they all began to talk at once. They gabbled a long time. Then the dark one got up and came to Zealand. "Urus," said he. "Jigit, jigit, Urus." The word jigit in their language signifies a brave young man. And he grinned, said something to the dragoman, and the dragoman said, "Give 1,000 roubles." Zealand would not give in. "I will not pay more than 500, but if you kill me, you will get nothing at all." The Tartars consulted together, sent out the menial, and they themselves looked first at the door, then at Zealand. The menial returned, followed by a rather stout man in bare feet, and almost stripped. His feet also were fastened to a clog. Zealand uttered an exclamation. He saw it was Kostuilan. So they had captured him too. They placed him next to his comrade. The two began to talk together, and the Tartars looked on and listened in silence. Zealand told how it had gone with him, Kostuilin told how his horse had stood stock still, and his gun had missed fire, and that this same Abdul had overtaken him and captured him. Abdul sprang to his feet, pointed to Kostuilin, and made some remark. The dragoman translated his words to mean that they now both belonged to the same master, and that the one who paid the ransom first would be freed first.
"Now," said he to Zeelan, "you lose your temper so easily, but your comrade is calm. He has written a letter home. They will send 5,000 silver rubles, and so he will be well fed, and he won't be hurt." And Zeelan said, "Let my comrade do as he pleases. Maybe he is rich, but I am not rich. I will do as I have already told you. Kill me if you wish, but it would not do you any good, and I will not pay you more than 500 rubles. They were silent. Suddenly Abdul leaped up, brought a little chest, took out a pen, a sheet of paper, and ink, and pushed them into Zeelan's hands, then tapped him on the shoulder and said by signs, "Write." He had agreed to take the 500 rubles. "Wait a moment," said Zeelan to the dragoman. "Tell him that he must feed us well, clothe us, and give us good, decent footwear, and let us stay together so that it may be pleasanter for us. And lastly, that he take off these clogs." He looked at his Tartar master and smiled. The master also smiled, and when he learned what was wanted, said, "I will give you the very best clothes, a cloak and boots fit for a wedding, and I will feed you like princes. And if you want to live together, why, you can live in the shed, but it won't do to take away the clogs. You would run away. Only at night will I have them taken off." Then he jumped up and tapped him on the shoulder. "You good, me good." Zeelan wrote his letter, but he put on it the wrong address, so that it might never reach its destination. He said to himself, "I shall run away." They took Zeelan and Kostuilin to the shed, strewed cornstalks, gave them water in a pitcher, and bread, 2 old Cherkesky, and some worn-out military boots. It was evident that they had been stolen from some dead soldier. When night came, they took off their clogs and locked them up in the shed. Thus Zeelan and his comrade lived a whole month. Their master was always on the grin. "You, Ivan, good. Me, Abdul, good." But he gave them wretched food, unleavened bread made of millet flour, cooked in the form of cakes, but often not heated through. Kostuilin wrote home again, and was anxiously awaiting the arrival of the money, and lost his spirits. Whole days at a time he sat in the shed and counted the days till his money should arrive, or else he slept. But Zeelan knew that his letter would not reach its destination, and he did not write another. Where, he asked himself, where would my mother get so much money for my ransom? And besides, she lived for the most part on what I used to send her. If she made out to raise 500 rubles, she would be in want till the end of her days. If God wills it, I may escape. And all the time he kept his eyes open, and made plans to elude his captors. He walked about the village. He amused himself by whistling, or else he sat down and fashioned things, either modelling dolls out of clay or weaving baskets of osiers, for Zeelan was a master at all sorts of handiwork. One time he made a doll with nose and hands and feet, and dressed in a Tartar shirt, and he set the doll on the roof. The Tartar women were going for water. Dina, the master's daughter, caught sight of the doll. She called the Tartar women. They set down their jugs, and looked, and laughed. Zeelan took the doll and offered it to them. They kept laughing, but did not dare to take it.
He left the doll, went to the barn, and watched what would take place. Dina ran up to the doll, looked around, seized the doll, and fled. The next morning at dawn he saw Dina come out on the doorstep with the doll, and she had already dressed it up in pieces of red cloth, and was rocking it like a little child, and singing a lullaby in her own language. The old woman came out, gave her a scolding, snatched the doll away, broke it in pieces, and sent off Dina to work. Zeeland made another doll, a still better one, and gave it to Dina. One time Dina brought a little jug, put it down, took a seat, and looked at him. Then she laughed and pointed to the jug. "What is she so gay about?" wondered Zeeland. He took the jug and began to drink. He supposed that it was water, but it was milk. He drank up the milk. "Good," says he. How delighted Dina was.
"Good, Ivan, good."
Then she jumped up, clapped her hands, snatched the jug, and ran away. And from that time she began to bring him secretly fresh milk every day. Now, sometimes the Tartars would make cheesecakes out of goat's milk and dry them on their roofs. So she used to carry some of these cakes secretly to him. And another time, when her father had killed a sheep, she brought him a piece of mutton in her sleeve. She threw it down and ran away. One time there was a heavy shower, and for a whole hour the rain poured as from buckets, and all the brooks grew royally. Wherever there had been a ford, the depth of the water increased to a fathom, and boulders were rolled along by it. Everywhere torrents were rushing, the mountains were full of the roaring. Now, when the shower was over, streams were pouring all through the village. Zeeland asked his master for a knife, whittled out a cylinder and some paddles, and made a water wheel, and fastened mannikins at the two ends. The little girls brought him some rags, and he dressed up the mannikins, one like a man, the other like a woman. He fastened them on, and put the wheel in a brook. The wheel revolved, and the dolls danced. The whole village collected, the little boys and the little girls, the women, and even the Tartars came and clucked with their tongues. "Hey, Uruz! Hey, Ivan!" The Abdul had a Russian watch, which had been broken. He took it and showed it to Zeeland, and clucked with his tongue. Zeeland said, "Let me have it. I will mend it." He took it, opened the penknife, took it apart. Then he put it together again, and gave it back. The watch ran. The Tartar was delighted, and brought him his old beshmet, which was all in rags, and gave it to him. Nothing else was to be done. He took it and used it as a covering at night. From that time Zeeland's fame went abroad, that he was a master. Even from distant villages they came to him. One brought him a gun-lock or a pistol to repair, another a watch. His master furnished him with tools, a pair of pincers and gimlets and a little file. One time a Tartar fell ill. They came to Zeeland. "Come, cure him." Zeeland knew nothing of medicine. He went, looked at the sick man, said to himself, "Perhaps he will get well anyway." He went into the shed and took water and sand and shook them up together. He whispered a few words to the water in presence of the Tartars, and gave it to the sick man to drink. Fortunately for him, the Tartar got well. Zeeland had by this time learned something of their language, and some of the Tartars became accustomed to him. When they wanted him, they called him by name, "Ivan, Ivan," but others always looked at him as if he was a wild beast. The red-bearded Tartar did not like Zeeland. When he saw him, he scowled and turned away, or else insulted him. there was another old man among them. He did not live in the village, but came from down the mountain. Zealand never saw him except when he came to the mosque to prayer. He was of small stature. On his cap he wore a white towel as an ornament. His beard and moustaches were trimmed. They were white as wool, and his face was wrinkled and brick-red. His nose was hooked like a hawk's, and his eyes were grey and cruel. And he had no teeth except 2 tusks. He used to come in his turban, leaning on his staff, and glare like a wolf. Whenever he saw Zealand, he would snort and turn his back. One time, Zealand went down the mountain to see where the old man lived. He descended a narrow path and saw a little stone-walled garden. On the other side of the wall were cherry trees, peach trees, and a little hut with a flat roof. He went nearer. He saw beehives made of straw, and bees flying and humming around them. And the old man was on his knees, busy doing something to one of the hives. Zealand raised himself up so as to get a better view, and his clog made a noise. The old man looked up, squealed. He whipped his pistol from his belt, and fired at Zealand, who had barely time to hide behind the wall. The old man came to make his complaint to Zealand's master. Abdul called him in, grinned, and asked him, "Why did you go to the old man's?" "I didn't do him any harm. I wanted to see how he lived." Abdul explained it to the old man, but he was angry, hissed, mumbled something, showed his tusks, and threatened Zealand with his hands. Zealand did not understand it all, but he made out that the old man wished Abdul to kill the 2 Russians, and not keep them in the village. The old man went off. Zealand began to ask his master, "Who is that old man?" And the master replied, "He is a great man. He used to be our first jigit. He has killed many Russians. He used to be rich. He had 3 wives and 8 sons. All lived in one village. The Russians came, destroyed his village, and killed 7 of his sons. 1 son was left and surrendered to the Russians. The old man went and gave himself up to the Russians also. He lived among them 3 months, found his son, killed him with his own hand, and escaped. Since that time he has stopped fighting. He went to Mecca to pray to God, and that's why he wears a turban. Whoever has been to Mecca is called a Haji, and wears a chalma. But he does not love you, Russians. He has bade me kill you, but I don't intend to kill you. I have paid out money for you. Besides, Ivan, I have come to like you. And so far from wishing to kill you, I would rather not let you go from me at all if I had not given my word." He laughed and began to repeat in broken Russian, "Tvoya, Ivan, Korosh, moya, Abdul Korosh. Ivan, are you good? Abdul, me good." Thus Zealand lived yet another month. In the daytime he walked about the village, or did some handiwork. But when night came, and it grew quiet, he tunneled away in his shed. It was hard work, digging, because of the stones, and he sometimes had to use his file on them. And thus he dug a hole under the wall big enough to crawl through. "Only," he thought, "I must know the region a little first, so as to escape in the right direction, and the Tartars wouldn't tell me anything." He chose a time when his master was absent. Then he went after dinner behind the village to a mountain. His idea was to reconnoitre the country. Now, when Abdul went away, he commanded his little son to follow Zealand, and not take his eyes from him. The little fellow tagged after Zealand, and kept crying,
"Don't go there. Father won't allow it. I will call the men if you go."
Zealand began to reason with him. "I am not going far," says he, "only to that hill,
I want to find some herbs so as to cure your people. Come with me. I can't run away with this clog. If you'll come, I will make you a bow and arrows tomorrow." He persuaded the lad. They went together. To look at, the mountain was not far, but it was hard work with the clog. He went a little distance at a time, pulling himself up by main strength. Zealand sat down on the summit and began to survey the ground. To the south, behind the shed, lay a valley, through which a herd was grazing, and another village was in sight at the foot of it. Back of the village was another mountain, still steeper, and back of that still another. Between the mountains lay a further stretch of forest, and then still other mountains, rising ever higher and higher. And higher than all stood snow-capped peaks white as sugar, and one snowy peak rose like a dome above them all. To the east and west also were mountains. In every direction the smoke of villages was to be seen in the ravines. "Well," he said to himself, "this is all their country." He began to look in the direction of the Russian possessions. At his very feet was a little river, his village surrounded by gardens. By the river some women, no larger in appearance than little dolls, were standing and washing. Behind the village was a lower mountain, and beyond it 2 other mountains covered with forests, and between the 2 mountains a plain stretched far, far away in the blue distance, and on the plain lay what seemed like smoke. Zealand tried to remember in what direction, when he lived at home in the fortress, the sun used to rise, and where it set. He looked. "Just about there," says he, "in that valley. Our fortress ought to be. There, between those 2 mountains, I must make my escape." The little sun began to slope toward the west. The snowy mountains changed from white to purple. The wooded mountains grew dark. A mist arose from the valley, and the valley itself, where the Russian fortress must be, glowed in the sunset as if it were on fire. Zealand strained his gaze. Something seemed to hang, waving in the air, like smoke arising from chimneys. And so it seemed to him that it must be from the fortress itself, the Russian fortress. It was already growing late. The voice of the mullah calling to prayer was heard. The herds began to return. The kine were lowing. The little lad kept repeating, "Let us go." But Zealand could not tear himself away. They returned home. "Well," thinks Zealand, "now I know the place. I must make my escape." He proposed to make his escape that very night. The nights were dark. It was the wane of the moon. Unfortunately, the Tartars returned in the evening. Usually they came in driving the cattle with them, and arrived in high spirits. But this time they had no cattle. But they brought a Tartar, dead on his saddle. It was the red-headed Tartar's brother who had been killed. They rode in solemnly, and all collected for the burial. Zealand also went out to look. They did not put the dead body in a coffin, but wrapped it in linen and placed it under a plane tree behind the village, where it lay on the sward. The mullah came. The old men gathered together, their caps bound around with towels. They took off their shoes and sat in rows on their heels before the dead. In front was the mullah, behind him 3 old men in turbans, and behind them the rest of the Tartars. They sat there with their heads bent low and kept silence. Long they kept silence. The mullah lifted his head and said, "Allah!" That means God. He said this one word, and again they hung their heads and were silent a long time. They sat motionless. Again the mullah lifted his head, saying, "Allah!"
and all repeated it after him. Allah. Then silence again. The dead man lay on the sward. He was motionless, and they sat as if they were dead. Not one made a motion. The only sound was the rustling of the foliage of the plane tree, stirred by the breeze. And then the mullah offered a prayer. All got to their feet. They took the dead body in their arms and carried it away. They brought it to a pit. The pit was not a mere hole, but was hollowed out under the earth like a cellar. They took the body under the armpits and by the legs, doubled it up, and let it down gently, shoved it forcibly under the ground, and laid the arms along the belly. The Nogayats brought a green osier. They laid it in the pit. Then they quickly filled it up with earth, and over the dead man's head they placed a gravestone. They smoothed the earth over, and again sat around the grave in rows. There was a long silence. Allah, Allah, Allah. They sighed and got up. The red-bearded Tartar gave money to the old man. Then he got up, struck his forehead 3 times with a whip, and went home. The next morning Zeelan saw the red-haired Tartar leading a mare through the village, and 3 Tartars following him. They went behind the village. Qazi Muhammad took off his beshmet, rolled up his sleeves, his hands were powerful, took out his dagger and sharpened it on a whetstone. The Tartars held back the mare's head. Qazi Muhammad approached and cut the throat. Then he turned the animal over and began to flay it, pulling away the hide with his mighty fists. The women and maidens came and began to wash the intestines and the viscera. Then they cut up the mare and carried the meat to the hut, and the whole village collected at Qazi Muhammad's to celebrate the dead. For 3 days they feasted on the mare and drank booza, and they celebrated the dead. All the Tartars were at home. On the 4th day, about noon, Zeelan saw that they were collecting for some expedition. Their horses were brought out. They put on their gear and started off, 10 men of them under the command of the red-headed Tartar. Only Abdul stayed at home. There was a new moon, but the nights were still dark. "Now," said Zeelan to himself, "we must escape today." And he told Kostuilan. But Kostuilan was afraid. "How can we escape? We don't know the way." "I know the way. But we should not get there during the night." "Well, if we don't get there, we will spend the night in the woods. I have some cakes. What are you going to do? It will be all right if they send you the money, but you see your friends may not collect so much, and the Tartars are angry now because the Russians have killed one of their men. They say they are thinking of killing us." Kostuilan thought and thought. "All right, let us go." Zeelan crept down into his hole and widened it so that Kostuilan also could get through. And then they sat and waited till all should be quiet in the village. As soon as the people were quiet, Zeelan crept under the wall and came out on the other side. He whispered to Kostuilan, "Crawl under." Kostuilan also crept under, but in doing so he hit a stone with his leg, and it made a noise. Now the master had a chained dog as a watch, a most ferocious animal. They called him Uliashin. Zeelan had been in the habit of feeding him. Uliashin heard the noise and began to bark and jump about, and the other dogs joined in. Zeelan gave a little whistle, threw him a piece of cake. Uliashin recognized him, began to wag his tail, and ceased barking. Abdul had heard the disturbance, and cried from within the house, "Hait, Hait, Uliashin!"
but Zealand scratched the dog behind the ears. The dog made no more sound, rubbed against his legs, and wagged his tail. They waited behind the corner. All became silent again. The only sound was the bleating of a sheep in the fold, and far below them the water roaring over the boulders. It was dark, but the sky was studded with stars. Over the mountain the young moon hung red, with its horns turned upward. In the valleys a mist was rising, white as milk. Zealand started up and said to his comrade, "Well, brother, aye da." They set out again. But as they got under way, they heard the call of the mullah on the minaret. "Allah, Bizim Allah, el-Rahman." That means the people will be going to the mosque. Again they sat down and hid under the wall. They sat there long, waiting until the people should pass. Again it grew still. "Now, God be with us." They crossed themselves and started. They went across the pasture and down the steep bank to the stream, crossed the stream and proceeded along the valley. The mist was thick and closed in all around them, but above their heads the stars could still be seen. Zealand used the stars to guide him which way to go. It was cool in the mist. It was easy walking, only their boots were troublesome. They were worn at the heels. Zealand took his off, threw them away, and walked barefoot. He sprang from stone to stone and kept glancing at the stars. Caucasus began to grow weary. "Go slower," said he. "My boots chafe me, my whole foot is raw." "Then take them off, it will be easier." Caucasus began to go barefoot, but that was still worse. He kept scraping his feet on the stones and having to stop. Zealand said to him, "You may cut your feet, but you will save your life. However, if you are caught, they will kill you, which would be worse." Caucasus said nothing, but crept along, groaning. For a long time they went down the valley. Suddenly they heard dogs barking at the right. Zealand halted, looked around, climbed up the bank, and felt about with his hands. "Ugh," said he, "we've made a mistake. We've gone too far to the right. Here is a strange village. I could see it from the hill. We must go back to the left, up the mountain. There must be a forest there." But Caucasus objected. "Just wait a little while. Let us get breath. My feet are all blood." "Brother, we will get well. You should walk more lightly. This way." And Zealand turned back toward the left, and uphill toward the forest. Caucasus kept halting and groaning. Zealand tried to hush him up, and still hastened on. They climbed the mountain, and there they found the forest. They entered it. Their clothes were all torn to pieces on the thorns. They found a little path through the woods. They walked along it. "Halt!" There was the sound of hoofs on the path. They stopped to listen. It sounded like the tramping of a horse. Then it also stopped. They set out once more. Again, the tramping hoofs. When they stopped, it stopped. Zealand crept ahead and investigated a light spot on the path. Something was standing there. Whether it was a horse or not, on it there was something strange, not at all like a man. It snorted, plainly. "What a strange thing!" Zealand gave a slight whistle. There was a dash of feet from the path into the forest, a crackling in the underbrush, and something rushed along like a hurricane, with a crashing of dry boughs. Caucasus almost fell to the ground in fright. But Zealand laughed and said, "That was a stag. Do you hear how it crashes through the woods with its horns? We were afraid of him, and he's afraid of us."
They went on their way. Already the Great Bear was beginning to set. The dawn was not distant, and they were in doubt whether they should come out right or not. Zealand was inclined to think that they were on the right track, and that it would be about 6.5 miles farther before they reached the Russian fortress. But there was no certain guide. You could not tell in the night. They came to a little clearing. Kostoilin sat down and said, "Do as you please, but I will not go any farther. My legs won't carry me." Zealand tried to persuade him. "No," said he, "I won't go. I can't go." Zealand grew angry. He threatened him. He scolded him. "Then I will go on without you. Goodbye." Kostoilin jumped up and followed. They went 2.5 miles farther. The fog began to grow thicker in the forest. Nothing could be seen before them. The stars were barely visible. Suddenly they heard the tramping of a horse just in front of them. They could hear his shoes striking on the stones. Zealand threw himself down on his belly and tried to listen by laying his ear to the ground. "Yes, it's someone on horseback coming in our direction." They slipped off to one side of the road, crouched down in the bushes, and waited. Zealand crept close to the path and looked. He saw a mounted Tartar riding along, driving a cow, and muttering to himself. When the Tartar had ridden by, Zealand returned to Kostoilin. "Well, God has saved us. Up with you. Come along." Kostoilin tried to rise, and fell back. "I can't. By God, I can't. My strength is all gone." The man was staggered and was bloated, and the sweat poured from him. And as they were caught in the forest in the midst of the cold fog, and his feet were torn, he lost all courage. Zealand tried to lift him by main force. Then Kostoilin cried, It hurts!" Zealand was frightened to death. "What are you screaming for? Don't you know that Tartar is near? He will hear you." But he said to himself, "Now if he is really played out, what can I do with him? I can't abandon a comrade." "Now," says he, "get up, climb on my back. I will carry you if you can't walk any longer." He took Kostoilin on his shoulders, holding him by the thighs, and went along the path with his burden. "Only," says he, "don't put your hands on my throat, for Christ's sake. Hold on by my shoulders." It was hard for Zealand. His feet were also bloody, and he was weary. He stopped and made it a little easier for himself by setting Kostoilin down and getting him higher up on his shoulders. Then he went on again. Evidently, the Tartar had heard Kostoilin scream. Zealand caught the sound of someone following them and shouting in his language. Zealand hid among the bushes. The Tartar aimed his gun. He fired it off but missed, began to whine in his native tongue, and galloped up the path. "Well," said Zealand, "we are lost, brother. The dog, he will be right back with a band of Tartars on our track. If we don't succeed in putting 2 miles between us, we're lost." And he thinks to himself, "The devil take it that I had to bring this clod along with me. Alone I should have got there long ago." Kostoilin said, "Go alone. Why should you be lost on my account?" "No, I will not go. It would not do to abandon a comrade." He lifted him again on his shoulders and started on. Thus he made 2/3 of a mile. It was forest all the way, and no sign of outlet. But the fog was now beginning to lift, and seemed to be floating away in little clouds. Not a star was any longer to be seen. Zealand was tired out. A little spring gushed out by the road. It was walled in with stones. There he stopped and dropped Kostoilin. "Let me rest a little," said he, "and get a drink. We will eat our cakes. It can't be very far now." He had just stretched himself out to drink when the sound of hoofs was heard behind them. Again They hid in the bushes at the right under the crest and crouched down. They heard Tartar voices. The Tartars stopped at the very spot where they had turned in from the road. After discussing a while, they seemed to be setting dogs on the scent. The refugees heard the sound of a crashing through the bushes. A strange dog came directly to them. He stopped and barked. The Tartars followed on their track. They also were strangers. They were seized, bound, lifted onto horses, and carried off. After they had ridden 2 miles, Abdul, their master, with 2 Tartars, met them. He said something to their new captors. They were transferred to Abdul's horses and were brought back to the village. Abdul was no longer grinning, and he said not a word to them. They reached the village at daybreak. The prisoners were left in the street. The children gathered around them, tormenting them with stones and whips, and howling. The Tartars gathered around them in a circle, and the old man from the mountain was among them. They began to discuss. Zelin made out that they were deciding on what should be done with them. Some said that they ought to be sent farther into the mountains, but the old man declared that they must be killed. Abdul argued against it.
"I have paid out money for them," said he. "I shall get a ransom for them."
But the old man said,
"They won't pay anything. They will only be an injury to us, and it is a sin to feed Russians. Kill them, and that is the end of it."
They separated. Abdul came to Zelin and reported the decision.
"If," says he, "the ransom is not sent in 2 weeks, I will flog you. And if you try to run away again, I will kill you like a dog. Write your letter and write it good."
Paper was brought to them. They wrote their letters. Clogs were put on their feet again. They were taken behind the mosque. There was a pit 12 feet deep, and they were thrust down into this pit. Life was made utterly wretched for them. Their clogs were not taken off, even at night, and they were not let out at all. Unbaked dough was thrown down to them as if they were dogs, and water was let down in a jug. In the pit it was damp and suffocating. Kostuilin became ill and swelled up, and had rheumatism all over his body, and he groaned or slept all the time. Even Zelin lost his spirits. He saw that they were in desperate straits, and he did not know how to get out of it. He had begun to make an excavation, but there was nowhere to hide the earth. Abdul discovered it and threatened to kill him. He was squatting down one time in the pit and thinking about liberty, and he grew sad. Suddenly, a cake fell directly into his lap. Then another, and some cherries followed. He looked up, and there was Dina. She peered down at him, laughed, and then ran away. And Zelin began to conjecture. Couldn't Dina help me? He cleared out a little place in the pit, picked up some clay, and made some dolls. He made men and women, horses and dogs. He said to himself, "When Dina comes, I will toss them up to her." But Dina did not make her appearance on the next day, and Zelin heard the trampling of horses' hoofs. Men came riding up. The Tartars collected at the mosque, arguing, shouting, and talking about the Russians. And he also heard the voice of the old man. Zelin could not understand very well, but he gathered that the Russians were somewhere near, and the Tartars were afraid that they would attack the village, and they did not know what to do with the prisoners. They talked a while and went away. Suddenly, Zeelan heard a rustling at the edge of the pit. He saw Dina squatting on her heels, with her knees higher than her head. She leaned over, her necklace hung down and swung over the pit, and her little eyes twinkled like stars. She took from her sleeve 2 cheesecakes and threw them down to him. Zeelan accepted them and said, "Why did you stay away so long? I've been making you some dolls. Here they are." He began to toss them up to her, one at a time, but she shook her head and would not look at them.
"I can't take them,"
said she. She was silent for a while, but sat there. Then she said,
"Ivan, they want to kill you."
She made a significant motion across her throat. "Who wants to kill me?"
"Father, the old men have ordered him to, but I am sorry for you."
And Zeelan said, "Well then, if you are sorry for me, bring me a long pole." She shook her head, meaning that it was impossible. He clasped his hands in supplication to her. "Dina, please, bring one to me, Dinushka."
"I can't,"
said she.
"They would see me. They are all at home."
And she ran away. Afterwards, Zeelan was sitting there in the evening and wondering what was going to happen. He kept looking up. He could see the stars, but the moon had not yet risen. The mullah uttered his call. Then all became silent. Zeelan began already to doze, thinking to himself, "The little maid is afraid." Suddenly, a piece of clay fell on his head. He glanced up. A long pole was sliding over the edge of the pit. It slid out, began to descend toward him. It reached the bottom of the pit. Zeelan was delighted. He seized it, pulled it along. It was a strong pole. He had noticed it before on his master's roof. He gazed up. The stars were shining high in the heavens, and Dina's eyes at the edge of the pit gleamed in the darkness like a cat's. She craned her head over and whispered,
"Ivan, Ivan."
And she waved her hands before her face, meaning, "Softly, please." "What is it?" said Zeelan.
"All have gone. There are only 2 at home."
Then Zeelan said, "Well, Kostuilan, let us go. Let us make our last attempt. I will help you." Kostuilan, however, would not hear to it. "No," says he. "It is not meant for me to get away from here. How could I go when I haven't even strength to turn over?" "All right, then. Goodbye. Don't think me unkind." He embraced Kostuilan. Then he clasped the pole, told Dina to hold it firmly, and tried to climb up. Twice he fell back, his clogs so impeded him. Kostuilan pushed him from below. He managed to get to the top. Dina pulled on the sleeves of his shirt with all her might, laughing heartily. Zeelan pulled up the pole and said, "Carry it back to its place, Dina, for if they found it they would flog you." She dragged off the pole, and Zeelan began to go down the mountain. When he had reached the bottom of the cliff, he took a sharp stone and tried to break the padlock of his clog. But the lock was strong. He could not strike it fairly. He heard someone hurrying down the hill with light, skipping steps. He said to himself, "That is probably Dina again." Dina ran to him, took a stone, and said,
"Daya, let me try it."
She knelt down and began to work with all her might, but her hands were as delicate as osseous. She had no strength. She threw down the stone and burst into tears. Zeelan again tried to break the lock, and Dina squatted by his side and leaned against his shoulder. Zeelan glanced up and saw at the left, behind the mountain, a red glow like a fire. It was the moon just rising. "Well," he said to himself, "I must cross the valley and get into the woods before the moon rises." He stood up and threw away the stone. He would have to go as he was, even with the clog. "Goodbye," says he. "Dinushka, I shall always remember you." Dina clung to him, searched with her hands for a place to stow away some cakes. He took the cakes. "Thank you," said he. "You're a thoughtful darling. Who will make you dolls after I'm gone?" And he stroked her hair. Dina burst into tears, hid her face in her hands, and scrambled up the hillside like a baby goat. He could hear in the darkness the jingling of the coins on her braids. Zeelan crossed himself, picked up the lock of his clog so that it might not make a noise, and started on his way, dragging his leg all the time and keeping his eyes all the time on the glow where the moon was rising. He knew the way. He had over 5 miles to go in a direct course, but he would have to strike into the forest before the moon became entirely visible. He crossed the stream, and now the light was increasing behind the mountain. He proceeded down the valley, and as he walked along he kept glancing around. Still the moon was not visible. The glow was now changing to white light, and one side of the valley grew brighter and brighter. The shadow kept creeping nearer and nearer to the mountain, till it reached its very foot. Zeelan still hurried along, all the time keeping in the shadow. He hurried as fast as he could, but the moon rose still faster, and now, at the right, the mountain tops began to be illuminated. He struck into the forest just as the moon rose above the mountains. It became as light and white as day. On the trees all the leaves were visible. It was warm and bright on the mountainside. Everything seemed as if it were dead. The only sound was the roaring of a torrent far below. He walked along in the forest and met no one. Zeelan found a little spot in the forest where it was still dark, and sat down to rest. While he rested, he ate one of his cakes. He procured a stone and once more tried to break the padlock, but he only bruised his hands and failed to break the lock. He arose and went on his way. When he had gone 3/4 of a mile, his strength gave out. His sore feet tortured him. He had to walk 10 steps at a time and then stop. "There's nothing to be done for it," says he to himself. "I will push on as long as my strength holds out. For if I sit down, then I shall not get up again. If I do not reach the fortress before it is daylight, then I will lie down in the woods and spend the day, and start on tomorrow night again." He walked all night. Once he passed 2 Tartars on horseback, but he heard them at some distance and hid behind a tree. Already the moon was beginning to pale. The dew had fallen. It was near dawn, and Zeelan had not reached the end of the forest. "Well," said he to himself, "I will go 30 steps farther, strike into the forest, and sit down." He went 30 steps and saw the end of the forest. He went to the edge. It was broad daylight. Before him, as on the palm of his hand, were the steppe and the fortress, and on the left, not far away on the mountain-side, fires were burning, or dying out. The smoke rose, and men were moving around the watchfires. He looked and saw the gleaming of firearms. Cossacks. Soldiers. Zeelan was overjoyed. He gathered his remaining strength and walked down the mountain, and he said to himself, "God help me if a mounted Tartar should get sight of me on this bare field. I should not escape him, even though I am so near." Even while these thoughts were passing through his mind, he saw at the left, on a hillock not 1,400 feet away, 3 Tartars on the watch. They caught sight of him, bore down upon him. Then his heart failed within him. Waving his arms, he shouted at the top of his voice, "Brothers! Help! Brothers!" Our men heard him. Mounted Cossacks dashed out toward him. They spurred their horses so as to outstrip the Tartars. The Cossacks were far off, the Tartars near. And now Zealand collected his last remaining energies, seized his clog in his hand, ran toward the Cossacks, and without any consciousness of feeling, crossed himself and cried, "Brothers! Brothers! Brothers!" The Cossacks were 15 in number. The Tatars were dismayed. Before they reached him, they stopped short. And Zealand was running toward the Cossacks. The Cossacks surrounded him and questioned him. "Who are you? What is your name? Where did you come from?" But Zealand was almost beside himself. He wept and kept shouting, "Brothers! Brothers!" The soldiers hastened up and gathered around him. One brought him bread, another kasha gruel, another vodka, another threw a cloak around him. Still another broke off his clog. The officers recognized him. They brought him into the fortress. The soldiers were delighted. His comrades pressed into Zealand's room. Zealand told them what had happened to him, and he ended his tale with the words, "That's the way I went home and got married. No, I see such is not to be my fate." And he remained in the service in the Caucasus. A month later, Kostoilin was ransomed for 5,000 rubles. He was brought home scarcely alive.